Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Arran Rogerson. I'm here with Alyssa Polizzi, and today the topic is, what is woo? And when we say woo, we're kind of using this term broadly speaking. We are incorporating ideas of New Age into that. There's some hippie stuff that we're including in that, even burner stuff that we're including in that. So woo as a general realm of practice, exploration, perception, philosophy, aesthetics, even. It's kind of like a woo aesthetic. We're going to try to explore all these things and try to get at what all these practices are circumambulating. There's something here that is real and powerful and compelling, and that's what we're going to try and get into. And we want to be clear that we are not dismissing woo. We don't want to make fun of it. We don't want to say that it's not real or that's bullshit. That's a common perspective on these practices. We don't think that, though there's definitely room for bullshit in woo, as there is in essentially every domain. So, Alyssa, why don't you just start us off with some opening thoughts about what is woo?
What is woo? It's a somewhat personal question for me because I feel that my natural disposition to the world and how I've moved through it has, and if you've read my Substack, one foot in the land of woo and one foot sort of grounded in what might be called reality. And woo to me has always represented this ability to kind of tap into mysticism, to explore practices that cultivate a sense of connection to the numinous, and is often, at least in these cultural times that we live in, filled with practices that are ranging anywhere from divination, like tarot or using a pendulum, to astrology, working with crystals, all of these really stereotypical ideas of woo. But like behind that, what's really happening is a phenomena in which we can explore the depths of our own self, our own inner workings through mystical, esoteric practices that maybe aren't offered readily in our culture. So, woo does have these connotations often of being associated with pseudoscientific ideas, things that aren't real, occultist practices, paranormal sort of realities that people seem to work within, energy systems of the body. But to me, these sort of speak to subtle realities that we can't view, yet for a great deal of people seem just as real as the material world. And woo is really an entrance point into this sort of mystical space. And what woo is in a modern world is, we'll kind of get into this a little bit, but really practices that allow individuals to explore that through their own path. And there are these sort of umbrellas of woo practices that have really risen up, partly through what might be called the New Age, partly through resurgences of old religious practices or old spiritual practices. But at its heart, to me, woo it's an esoteric exploration, and it's a practice in mysticism.
All right. As usual, we're going to bring up a slideshow and just use some visual aids here. So when we talk about woo, again, we're circumambulating something, some sort of entity called woo, but there's a lot of things associated with woo stereotypically. One of those things is tarot, and it's a good demonstration of how mainstream woo has become. Tarot is very mainstream now, and it's something that is quite popular. And it's likely that if you're watching or listening to this podcast, this live stream that you either have explored tarot yourself or you know someone who has. I think that's probably quite likely. And even in the sort of mainstream normie world, a lot of people have been exposed to tarot or are exploring tarot, and obviously it's something that we like, and that we have explored a lot on this channel, and that Alyssa is definitely very plugged into and uses very often, even in corporate business settings. So, Alyssa, what is tarot? Why is tarot woo? You're still on mute.
Thank you. Partly, I think tarot is considered woo because it has moved sort of from its traditional space as a occultist practice in secret societies, which you see in like the early to late sort of 19th century, into this idea of a kind of underground psychic culture where there's someone on TV saying they'll read your cards, or the psychic on the corner with their sign, come in for the reading. And there's all of this sort of, it's shrouded in this mystery. It's connected to what might be called like stereotypical fortune telling practices. And the idea behind it, especially how you might see tarot talked about or shown culturally, like in movies or in TV shows, really puts forward this idea that the cards are being used to tell the future. And when you interact with them, there is a kind of mystical, magical element that's happening, and that starts to move into that woo territory, partly because it's a sort of unknown, secretive, mystical idea, but on the other hand is sort of seen as something that's very pseudo-religious, is making a claim that it can tell the future. It kind of brings up that relationship to woo that makes people feel really uncomfortable, and taps into this sense that there is other layers of reality that we can move within if we only know how. But what is tarot outside of what I might consider to be some of those stereotypical ideas is really this comprehensive symbolic system that allows you to tap into the kind of mythopoetic imagination. And when we start dealing with that, we're moving through the land of archetypes, we're moving through symbolic language, and we can, in essence, tap into parts of ourself, the unconscious, you might say, aspects of shadow that aren't readily accessible to us through ego consciousness. And when we work with the cards, we sort of stimulate these deep inner workings, these deep insights, and it seems to sort of come from nowhere, or there seems to be a kind of magic in the synchronicity of the cards. So tarot kind of plays on some of the foundational layers that you need for deep unconscious exploration, deep inner workings, but it's also has this other tone of the woo layer, because we've seen these cards used in a culture that was kind of built around this idea of fortune telling, divination, without much explanation of what's actually happening, or at least a some sort of strong foundation of like why this is real and why you should use it. It's just it's existed sort of under the layer of the subculture of woo, and because of that, it really carries its own energy with it. It carries its own influence with it. But when you start to really interact with the cards and look at them through a psychological lens, you will find that these are practices that you can replicate elsewhere, like in dream work or active imagination. So, what do you think, Arin?
Um, these practices. Here's a slide on Wicca, witchcraft, stuff like that. What you're getting at is that these practices, they speak to a part of us that is starving for attention, essentially, and
Mm.
that could be thought of as sort of the imaginal or the spiritual or
Sure. Yeah.
the kind of mythical narrative instincts that we have, the language of the unconscious. But there's a way that we relate to the world. There is a layer of reality for us that is deeply experiential and deeply subjective and deeply from a perspective. And that's what subjectivity refers to, is it's from a perspective, and that's what's real for us. um,
Mm.
so tarot, for instance, is tapping into that language and sort of waking up some of that energy in us that is more of a kind of spiritual energy. And that's not really something that can be quantified or measured very easily, which is why it's in opposition to scientific viewpoints in some way. Um, but you can kind of see what we're getting at with some of these weird practices, is that they're speaking to a part of us that um, isn't spoken to by a scientific materialist viewpoint that is so, or at least historically in the last century, has been so um, pervasive and influential in our culture, is
Yeah.
sort of the materialism, the literalism, the need for uh, a technological fluency, math, science, STEM, all that stuff. So Wicca, witchcraft, this is something that's also pretty popular, though certainly um, more so among women. But it's probably going to be true for most of these practices. Maybe we can get into that too. Is why is
Mm.
this? Why is woo more of a feminine thing than it is a masculine thing? Crystals. This is one of the, excuse me, probably like most stereotypical woo artifacts. It's easy to make fun of. There's something about it that seems readily mocked, like, oh, you're into crystals, or you buy crystals. Um, and it's interesting because they are such simple physical objects, and from, again, sort of a scientific materialist perspective, it's just a rock, right? It's very easy to say this is just a fucking rock, like that. It's just a rock, like, and yet if you can kind of tap into a sort of more experiential realm, there's something about these rocks that are beautiful, and they seem to kind of have some sort of energy. Like, they seem like they're magical. If you were going to
Mm.
hand someone a magic item in a fantasy universe, you might hand them a crystal. And there's something about that that makes sense to us. This is a magic item. And that's, again, what's what's tapping into with woo, is that it's tapping into the experience of being human, even perhaps at the cost of a sort of materialist reality.
I think one point to bring up about crystals as well is it's another phenomena that we're seeing with the rise of woo or new age in especially like the last 5 to 10 years, where maybe the idea of having crystals or believing in crystals, quote unquote, seemed pretty strange. And nowadays is extremely popular to the degree that, you have crystal stores around, every like main downtown and probably like big hip cities and things like that. And certainly I feel over the years that I have been into a variety of different practices that might be considered woo, even going back to like my teenage years, that this seemed very counterculture, that it seems sort of underneath the surface. And now we have, I don't know, like all of these kind of big websites or news sources talking about tarot, talking about astrology, talking about the use of crystals, to the point it's like this cannot be ignored. And maybe still like the degree of which we can say this is real or true can be argued, but it can't be denied that this is becoming a mainstream way of relating to what one might say is like this spiritual realm. And crystals are a huge, huge part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, you just go to some place like Mount Shasta in California, and there seems to
Yeah,
be a crystal shop, if not multiple crystal shops, on every block
right.
of the
Although,
downtown area,
yeah, I kinda wonder though, is that Shasta seems to me to be like an old new age hub, like, probably since the
for sure.
'70s. It's been and that's, like, another idea behind the new age often are, like, how do I even put this? Like, the belief in, like, different races or different worlds, and there's, like, the belief that, like, Mount Shasta itself is, like, a place where, like, aliens are, like Lemurians or something.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Anyways, the point I was going to make is that there's all these crystal shops, and somehow they stay in business.
for
Um,
sure. Yeah,
like you would think a
each
city
one.
that's the size of like 10,000 people, which Shasta is, you probably only need one crystal shop, right, for 10,000
Yeah,
people. But
yeah.
no, Shasta I think literally has more than 10 crystal shops, and they all stay in business somehow, which is interesting.
Mm,
Um, Sage and incense. This is also another stereotypical sort of woo artifact. Um,
yeah.
I think Alyssa has some probably behind her on her bookshelf somewhere. Um,
Probably over there somewhere. I'll say one thing about the use of these sort of cleansing practices is like one thing that we see with woo or new age is that a lot of the influences and practices that they're drawing upon are from old esoteric traditions or even native practices or more like naturalistic, like pagan religious practices. And there has been a lot of pushback against the sort of co opting of that, you might say. And there is quite a bit of controversy with the use of sage as it is kind of drawn more from indigenous practices and the over harvesting of sage plants just to meet the demand now of like Western society's desire to use it without actually, doing it in a sustainable way. So um,
that's a whole another conversation about
it is
the relationship with indigenous practices and
for sure.
indigenous peoples. That's
Yeah,
definitely a huge part of New Age, and woo. I think is sort of uh, trying to recover these ways that like
yeah, right.
the Native Americans had a certain spiritual practice, and here I am, a 6-year-old white male from San Francisco, and I'm trying to use these practices too. Uh, I don't think we'll get too deeply into that because some of that just sort of dips into politics also,
For sure.
and that is another aspect of this though that I think is interesting. So we can kind of comment on that as we go on
Yeah,
of why that. Um, Here's a guy meditating on a mountain, uh, surrounded by astrological symbols. Astrology again is a fairly mainstream um, tool or practice for divination. Um, Astrology is its whole another can of worms there with astrology. That's very complicated, much more complicated than tarot,
for sure. It's
from my
so
perspective at
old.
least.
It's
Yeah,
it's such an old practice, and so to me, there's a really interesting thread that can be pulled upon about, what it looks like for certain things to kind of come back around in society or to be drawn out of the kind of ancient world. And astrology is one of those, but what sort of ancient Babylonian astrology might have looked like compared to modern Western astrology is very different in the way that it's being used. Not that I can comment too deeply because I don't know much about astrology, but a lot of these practices ultimately are not just manifesting in modern consciousness. Many of them are being drawn upon, whether that's old native traditions or even older cultures traditions as well.
this is a really stereotypical woo image, which is the meditating person. You also have the chakras here. Chakras are something else that is drawn from a lineage,
Yeah,
a very deeply explored system of thought regarding the body and energy. But it has been kind of popularized, and people talk about these things a lot as far as like chakras and what that's tapping into. Again, the meditating person is also, this image is very, very woo as far as woo aesthetic. It's like you have
Mm,
the person who is essentially transcending, or they're becoming enlightened. There's always like a lot of light and uh, colors of the rainbow, someone meditating. That aesthetic is interesting and something to touch upon as well. Why the woo aesthetic in woo art? Um, you can see that here. Like this, this is, it's a little intense. It's psychedelic. That's another
yeah.
aspect of this. But this is recognizable as a certain style of art that I would call woo. Um, Things like this. Not even sure who this is supposed to be. At the bottom.
Like
Um,
an archangel of some kind.
I guess so. I guess so. But a lot of sacred geometry at the top.
Right.
Occult symbols.
It's very loud.
That's a motorcycle getting started outside of my window. Uh, you can still hear me though, right?
Yeah, better now. Yeah.
Um, this is Alex Gray. I don't know if he would call himself a new age artist,
I
but
think he's more psychedelic in nature.
it's like a devil. There's still sort of there's aspects of imagery, like the eye on the female's chest.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
there's still overlap here. These are different styles, of course, but it's still tapping into a certain kind of art
Hmm.
that really evokes this realm. Um, I like this
Energy
image,
healing.
Reiki.
Yeah.
I like it because they've actually added in a light effect, um, to sort of communicate what Reiki is doing. Is that you're actually sort of uh, channeling an energy, and
Yeah. Yeah.
if you've had Reiki done, or if you've observed Reiki, you can't actually see any literal light, but that is the experience. Is essentially some sort of uh, manipulation of energy in some way.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. This sort of sense of being able to tap into these universal energies and kind of be that conduit for it and then transfer it from you, the conduit, to another individual. And
Right.
I would say like the other layer behind this in the new age or woo belief system is behind healing in general and alternative practices, with energy healing being one of those cornerstones, which certainly gets, I think, a lot of the side eye from um, individuals who have a more Western scientific point of view.
Um, Here you're getting to some of the practices, but also the again the kinds of aesthetics, the fashion of people who are plugged into this world. Um, I think this is a didgeridoo, right? Is that what he's playing, or
I don't
maybe
know.
it's
Are
something more.
didgeridoos like really, really, really big?
Yeah, this might be like a
I don't know.
shofar, something like that. Some kind of. Anyways, and there's a woman lying down. This is in Sedona, Arizona, which is a big new age hotspot. Um, lots of people go there for these kinds of practices and to shop for um, woo artifacts. Um, this is still Sedona. This is two middle-aged women who are engaging in sound healing, presumably. Is that an accurate term, Alyssa? You think?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so let's pause the slideshow for now and let's kind
Yeah.
of talk about. So that's kind of a range of um, practices, lifestyles, objects, imagery associated with woo, and what are all these stuff? Again, I'm going to use this word for the third time in this podcast. I think circumambulating. All of this is sort of revolving around some kind of thing, and what are we getting at here with
Yeah.
woo?
Yeah. I mean, I think a point that we made earlier and it is really important to bring up is the idea of what these practices do for individuals that maybe compensate aspects of spiritual practice or religious tradition that are no longer a foundational pillar in the lives of the sort of modern, especially Western individual. The rise of woo or the rise of the new age is sort of taking place of where we might have seen older religious traditions or older religious structures and how they helped mediate these experiences to the numinous, to God, to our spiritual centers. And not only does that allow us to sort of build a relationship that helps, I don't know, sort of make sense of the world and our lives, which rarely make sense at all. But it also helps us go inwardly to tap into something much deeper. So these woo practices, these new age practices, are coming up as a sort of counterpoint to that loss of our relationship to God in a traditional way, our loss of belief in maybe old traditional religious systems, and also I think like the height and rise of individualism and the fact that you can enter into the woo space or the new age space however you want to, take what you want, leave what you don't really have a teacher that tells you what to do necessarily, follow what feels right, follow what feels good, leave one scene, go into another. So there's a lot of factors that are happening. But to me, I sort of see it ultimately as like this that sort of spiritual hunger and that desire to enter into what Jung might call like the religious function or the religious attitude of our instincts, of our psyche.
Yeah, woo is, it's a bit of a reaction to um, the status quo, and what I mean by
Mhm,
the status quo is sort of a kind of culture and a kind of uh, social and societal structure that has existed in the West. Um, Woo is very counterculture.
mhm,
That's a big part of what it's about and why people are drawn to it in the first place. Is it's a reaction to the status quo, and so a lot of it is, um, people who feel like they're kind of a misfit. That can be
mhm,
part of it. Is like they sort of have decided that they don't fit in to whatever they consider to be like normal culture, and there's kind of this accepting, vibrant, interesting culture of weirdos or unusual people who are interested in unusual things, and there's something that feels good about belonging to that. Um, it, a lot of woo, I think, is sort of tapping into a more individualistic and accepting energy and open energy of spiritual exploration. That's very, again individualistic. Like it can take you wherever you want to go, and it's very much about discovering who you are and
mhm,
manifest your true self as much as possible. And that,
yeah,
I think, is in contrast to a more traditional structure that is either that you're, part of a bigger system that you need to fit into like a cog, or there's rules, there's a way of life that is good. A lot of what traditional religion, uh, especially the best example was something like Christianity, but probably even more so, Orthodox Judaism, is sort of preaching a good way of life. There are rules and there's structure and there's things that you should do and traditions that you should follow, things that you should maintain in order to live a good life. And it's very important that you follow these structures and these rules. And that's one kind of more masculine, orderly religious energy, but that can kind of stomp out a lot of the open, free, individualistic exploration that comes from sort of like being myself and breaking free and kind of flowing in any direction I want to flow with my spirituality. And I think woo is a manifestation of that, for better or for worse, right?
yeah, yeah. You in some ways need the balance to that. Like you need the counter to what might be seen as like overly dogmatic, overly strict, overly tyrannical in its intensity and restrictions. But the flip side to that is that when you have created an environment and a sort of like complete deconstructed open frontier, you have no sense of communal body that's governing these practices. Certainly, I think there are like subgroups within the general practices of woo or the new age where people come together and there's maybe that sense of accountability or the ability to keep each other in check or keep each other grounded. But I think one attribute of woo practices or of new age is like how far off the deep end it tends to go, so that you might have a sense of even these like guru types who kind of like rise into power because they hold so much of that energy and can gather people to them. And they're talking about all these mystical, powerful practices. And yet there isn't a way to keep that from being dangerous to the community. Or you have ideas that get woven into woo practices that really seem to sort of distort reality in strange ways. And I guess a very simple example of that is how, because I'm such a avid practicer of tarot and have studied it quite a bit and its history, to me, it's strange that there have been these beliefs around tarot that the only way that you can begin to study tarot or work with a deck is if it's gifted to you, which is like pretty harmless as a belief, but is quite pervasive actually. Maybe not so much now in the last 5 years, but something I was definitely running into about 8 years ago or so. And where does it come from that there has to be like something that's handed down to you, some magical way that the cards show up on your doorstep rather than feeling drawn to the practice, wanting to use it as a tool of introspection and self exploration and contemplation and owning that for what it is and studying it, and maybe engaging other people about it. Instead, you have these strange ideas that kind of crop up when there isn't a safeguarded system of a lineage that kind of holds it into its roots. So there's like a tension between things need to evolve in the culture and the way that things feel too ossified or strict. Um, and I think that's oftentimes in the new age or in woo practices, we see the complete lack of structure and the total openness often leads to belief systems, ideas, or even movements that can be hurtful towards people at the very least seem to distort reality in quite strange ways.
Yeah, so you're touching on a lot of good points here. Again, as an exploration of spirituality that is very individualistic and open, and it's whatever you want it to be in some sense, very accepting of whatever practice you want to explore, as long as it's not impinging on someone else's practice. Um, there's a lot of beauty in that, and people are really drawn to that because they're starving for spiritual practices. They're starving for religion, really, and they
Yeah,
can find a lot of the things they're looking for in these practices and in these movements, which is sort of like, um, again, tapping into the kind of language of the unconscious, tapping into my subjective experience, mirroring my creativity and my experience off these mediums like tarot and astrology, um, divination that reflects back my experience, and that like feels very good and balanced to be able to do that, and that's really beautiful. But as we know, people left to their own devices, let's say when people are in sort of a vacuum of individuality where they can do whatever they want, and this is and woo and new age practices are very much like that. Like you can kind of explore whatever you want, and you can pick and pull from any culture and any tradition you want to make like these like hybrid sort of like religious uh systems. um the danger is that people tend to gravitate towards what feels good, right? Or they gravitate towards what makes them feel something nice and stimulating. um Often what makes them feel some sort of aliveness, and they'll do that naturally and with no one to jump in and challenge them and say, hey, aren't you maybe being a little masturbatory, or aren't you just sort of smoothing over all this darkness inside of you, or aren't you kind of avoiding
Mm,
your responsibility to sort of become a better person in favor of these just like positive, nice feeling practices? Uh, there's nothing or no one around to do that. There's no rule structure that says, "Hey, like this isn't actually doing anything for you." And that's why I think a lot of woo practices move in the direction of spiritual bypassing so often, or move in the direction of what I would call toxic positivity. Like always love, always beauty. Everything is great. Can't you just see how great everything is? And that's nice, but the reality is that like not everything's great and not everything's right within you, and you actually have a lot of work to do, and you have a lot of work to do that's going to be quite scary and challenging and exhausting. And you know, that's kind of the trouble here is there's like the positive practices that maybe aren't actually doing much for you to improve your life. But with that also comes, as you were saying, sort of the distortion of reality, that it also leads to taking on actual ontologies, taking on a metaphysics of the world that is inaccurate and actually not very useful because it feels good. Like
yeah.
it'd be nice for me to believe that maybe that I can talk to spirits. Like I like how that feels, let's say, and I'll gravitate towards that because it feels good, and I will do that in opposition to any sort of physical or scientific explanation that actually gives me a better idea of what's real, you know.
Yeah. There was a James Hillman quote that I heard recently. I think the lecture was by Richard Tarnos, and he mentions how the New Age is trapped in the light, or has a sort of over identification with the light. And he was kind of contrasting that to at least psychiatry and psychology at the time being more trapped in the dark. But the point being, this over identification with the light, with these practices that are one, I think, very simply ego driven, like so straightforward of this is what I feel drawn to, this is what feels good, this makes me feel powerful in some way, but it often, when our conscious awareness is the the main force that's driving our choices and we aren't being forced into uncomfortable places, we aren't going to dig into the shadow, like we're not going to dig into the uncomfortable parts of ourselves that we do not identify with or that we feel we can't own in any way. And many, I think, practices in the new age not only sort of lift those beliefs up higher and higher, one might say, like these ego driven belief systems and practices, but there isn't that sense of accountability or being forced to kind of look into the darkness in ways that even if you were just doing it maybe through a psychotherapy practice you might be forced to do, or in some religious practices, um, even the idea I think behind confession and the idea behind sin, which, coming from a Catholic background myself, is a very it's a very complex thing that most of us have a relationship with, because there's these ways that the idea of sin has been sort of twisted into this very punishing dynamic for those in maybe more strict Catholic upbringings. But when we look behind this idea that by nature of being human, we have darkness. By nature of being human, we sin, and that we have to reconcile with that in some way, that we have to bring it forth, kind of like pull it out from our depths and speak it into a safe container, like the confessional booth. It's actually quite a powerful practice. So, where in these other systems of thought in the new age or in woo are we forcing ourselves to look at the shadow, to look at the darkness, to walk a more grounded path of individuation that forces us really to reconcile with the deep repository of shadow material that we all have. And I think another point to bring up with that is, especially maybe in the last couple of years, the idea behind the shadow and shadow work has become very cool. I don't know, interesting. It's bleeding into a lot of the new age or into a lot of the woo, but there's a huge mischaracterization of what that even is. And maybe that's a conversation for another time. But ultimately, that even their attempts to sort of look at shadow or do shadow work can be defined then as like the way that people say you're just not good enough, or it's like a very low resolution, watered down way of looking at the shadow. um, so a lot of these practices that would ultimately bring a lot more evolution of ego consciousness to be like relativized by unconscious factors, to have yourself challenged and stretched into a more sort of structured, strengthened psychic form, are being left on the table in Woo.
I'm gonna bring the slideshow back up. How do I? Oh, it's already up. Um, so there's overlap. Again, vague term. Woo is very vague. What are we even referring to? But there's a lot of overlap with sort of like the hippie culture that emerged in the 60s. And again, you kind of see there's a certain aesthetic to it. It's very countercultural, right? Like long hair, beards, um, outfits that are less conservative and kind of more free flowing, either in their aesthetic. They might be a very colorful and flowery, like a tie dye shirt is very like, it's very vibrant and loud. It's very much in contrast to a business suit, which might be muted and dark and, very purpose driven. This is kind of a less purpose driven way of being and a more kind of accepting, free way of being. There's also, certainly women dressing in a more revealing way and getting more in touch with their sexuality and feeling free to express their sexuality and explore it. Um, and you can see this as kind of the early beginnings of what became sort of new age in the 70s and then has progressed into different shapes, kind of merging with modern technological culture. The motorcycle's back. This is great timing. This really never happened before. This motorcycle. Okay, it stopped. But you can see that there's a lot of overlap between these things that we're seeing here, and a lot of that overlap is in the aesthetic, the colorfulness, the light, the sort of vibrance that feels very stimulating and open. There's kind of psychedelia going there, and there is that overlap with even like what it's like to do drugs. There's an experience of often of openness and stimulation and being exposed to like a different layer of reality. If we back up in the slideshow, you can again see this in the art, that like there's kind of like this feeling of like openness and light as opposed to a more kind of structured, ordered, definitive way of interacting with the world. But this has progressed over time. It's kind of merged with technology. It's kind of merged with the internet. It's clearly, still present in our culture and is even becoming quite mainstream. This is Burning Man, and if you've listened to the podcast, we actually bring up Burning Man pretty frequently because we've been a couple times, and it's a very interesting cultural phenomenon. Of like what's happening at Burning Man, and you're getting a lot of the same sort of things. People are completely open and free to express themselves however they want to express themselves and to do whatever they want to do essentially at these festivals. Um, and that's very much what Woo is about, is free self-expression and exploration. And it's very religious. Again, we keep saying that. If you look at Burning Man, this is religion. It's not the stereotypical reduced way that we think of religion as like, well, religion just means Christianity. It's like, okay, but what is Christianity other than a collection of people getting together to do something that resonates with some sort of purpose or aim or goal? And people come together to Burning Man and share in some kind of goal. And the building. What are you laughing at? You're laughing at this image?
No, at Timothy's comment about the motorcycle
Oh,
engine is
you can
very
bring
good.
that you can bring that on screen if you want.
Oh, that's right, yeah, check out
Yeah.
this great comment.
Yeah. Synchronicity.
Yeah,
Um, uh, anyways, woo, the return of religion, very much so. Um, and you can see it, here's the man at Burning Man. This is a religious figure. This is like a great structure that's been built. It's kind of like the Sphinx or like the pyramids of Egypt or the giant golden Buddha statue. In many ways, there's something very much about coming together and organizing our energy into a single point, around which we rally. And um, that's religion. And woo is very much about kind of trying to rediscover that energy, um, that's been sort of wiped away from our experience and our culture, because science has been such an important part of our progress in society, or at least in our generation of wealth in society. It's also sterilized a lot of what it means to be human,
mm,
um, right? And you can
yeah,
see that this is trying to bring it back in some way, and all these practices are trying to bring it back. Um, this is actually called the temple, right? This is like a religious structure that's being built, and the actual burning of the man, which is like what happens on the last day of the festival, is very, very religious. Everyone's here. They're all surrounding this campfire, this torch, you might say, and they've all sort of ignited it, and they're all cheering together. And it's all kind of trying to rediscover and piece together a new form of spiritual and religious connection to the world. And that's very much what Woo is getting at.
yeah, it just it's unfortunate that it kind of has this other thread of, well, it's total bullshit basically, or like that's
Mm,
pseudoscience and that's not real. And so the practices immediately are denigrated. But if we can sort of hold this mindset, at least that there is something valuable here, that the phenomena is important, that it's happening on a cultural level, then it's speaking to a certain need that isn't being met. It's like, how do we then interact with these practices in a way that feels meaningful? How do we integrate it more deeply into our society where there is this sort of void of spirituality or religious practice, religious devotion, you might say, that we so hunger for naturally? Um, and it speaks both to, in some ways, the loss of what religion has meant for a lot of people traditionally. And I think that's partly like my own story, like coming from a pretty, I don't know, religious family in a way, because my family is from like the old country in Italy, where it's like, the practices of worshiping God were just as regular and as real as anything else that they did in their life. And yet, as it moved sort of deeper into uh, being American, it felt like more and more lost. And even my interactions at church felt more and more hollow. And so, at a very young age, there was an impulse and a desire to want to explore the spiritual realm, to want to build a relationship to that higher power. And, Catholicism didn't really seem to fit. And so at a very, very young age, I started looking elsewhere. And not that I felt that I've ever been so rooted into a new age practice that I would say I'm a new age person, but I've kind of taken a step in those directions because the loss of that structure of those traditions were gone. And it's like, well, I need to find it elsewhere. So, the instinct and the urge to want to worship God in some form, however you really want to look at that, it's going to manifest. And if it doesn't manifest in a traditional space, you're going to see it popping up elsewhere. As most people who find themselves in the new age or find themselves in woo practices want, they yearn for something. They want some form of spiritual practice to integrate into their life, but they just can't find something that fits anymore, in the old structures. So I think that's like probably a lot of people's story too, is they're searching and they're searching for something that can meet their needs, and also allow them to still feel that they have some sort of creative control on that exploration.
Yeah. A lot of good points there. Um, there's, I think it's important to note that what organized religion has become has shifted over time, and that a lot of the practices that we're looking for in Wu, um, those probably used to be there with a lot of
Mm,
these lineages, with a lot of these traditions, and that um, Christianity, for instance, I think has been a victim over time of scientific materialism. Um, in the sense that what science has done is that it's given us this sort of mindset that there is something called reality, and it's a physical material thing that actually is measurable and quantifiable, and you can prove it and you can falsify things. And that mindset is actually a recent mindset. Like that idea of materialism never existed until several centuries ago.
mm,
And before then, everyone's connection to the world was much more mystical and mythical, and again, phenomenological. There's kind of like more of this subjective experience that is actually part of how we establish what's real. And you can see that with like alchemy, is that like you don't have like this scientific practice and this woo practice. It's like they're the same thing in the past. It's
yeah.
like they're both just cohesively trying to make sense of reality. Um, and you see that with astrology as well, is you don't have like a woo practice of astrology and a science practice of astronomy. They're like the same thing in the past. But as time has gone on, this scientific way of looking at the world has gradually sort of washed away and sterilized a lot of the experiential phenomenological interaction with reality that is so meaningful and so important to us. So even Christianity has had to sort of integrate this. Like, what do we do about science? What do we do about this world of propositional truth of what's real and what's not? Um, they've had to sort of grapple with that. And what's happened is that Christianity, I think, and other religions have been sterilized as well, until they've just sort of been boiled down to a set of beliefs, right? Because like science is kind of like, you can take science and you can establish a set of beliefs with the world, um, and then you take that, and I guess like, well, everything has to be like that. So Christianity is also just a set of beliefs. There's a thing called God, and it's he's in the sky and he's got a beard and he judges you. But that's like a misinterpretation of what religion actually is, because religion is more of a lifestyle. It's more of a set of practices. It's a way of interacting with the world that is very, very important to our sense of meaning and to living a good life. Um, so the experience that a lot of us have had as children growing up and going to church, which I think is true for a lot of us, um, is that we are engaged in something that is vacuous and empty, because it's actually been sterilized of all of this sort of mystical kind of experiential side of it. Um, and so science has had this effect on everything, basically, and we're trying to regain that. And so these woo practices, um, they can be easily dismissed because they're not that scientific side of reality. They're kind of more this experiential, phenomenological side of reality, which means they're hard to prove and hard to falsify. But they're very, very important and very powerful in our experience. Everyone needs to have a spiritual side of their life, like everyone does. And if you look at spiritual practices, if you look at things like woo, if you look at things that people do, like tarot, for instance, and you just dismiss it outright as superstition, or that like that's what stupid people do, you are absolutely, first of all, you're ignorant, but second of all, you're missing out on a huge side of reality that's very, very important, that you could discover. Uh, Not necessarily through doing these practices. I'm not saying that like everyone needs to go out and start doing astrology, But it would be a good idea to explore them and be like, what are people getting out of this? Because what they're getting out of it is real, right? They're getting something that's very fulfilling. They're getting something that's very meaningful, and they're mostly participating in the kind of imaginal spiritual fabric of reality. And through woo, you can kind of get in touch with that and understand it. Um, so for me, it's been very important to look at these things and try to get at the core: is why does this work for people? Why is it powerful? Why is it beautiful? Why is it meaningful? And to understand it. Um, but that doesn't necessarily translate over to me getting dreadlocks and wearing an alpaca sweater. Uh, like I don't have to be converted over into these things. It's enough to just understand them and to appreciate them. Uh, and I think that everyone needs to do that. Essentially, they need to reckon with what this is as a movement, what's coming back into the world.
Doesn't look like we have any questions from anyone, although I'll say it uh, over the live stream right now. If you've got any questions for us, drop them in the chat. We only have a few minutes left in the live stream. And I thought those were like some really great closing thoughts, Arran, because ultimately, even if you find the idea of these practices quite strange and out there, there's something to be said by willing to entertain what they mean to others and what they're fulfilling on that psychological level. And what might it mean for you to at least reflect on the idea of a version of this in your own life? Do you feel fulfilled in that space? And if so, what fulfills it? Do you have a spiritual practice? Do you have a religious practice that um, is sufficient enough that you don't feel like you have to turn to these more modern manifestations of them? Or if it feels like a place of huge discomfort that you don't want to go, that's probably an indication that there's something there that needs to be worked on a little bit. That resistance to it, especially if there's a huge recoil from the idea behind the new age practices, is likely like you've been impacted by that sense of the stripping back of the spiritual mythic realm that is so a part of just our foundations as people. So um all right,
We
looks
got a
like
few
we've got some
questions.
questions.
These,
Yep.
these, are, these are good questions too, and we can stay over just a little bit to try and answer
Mhm.
them. This is from Timothy. We've touched upon this a little bit. We can kind of give a more focused. We can address this more specifically. What are the pitfalls of woo? Uh, there are obviously pitfalls of woo. I think that's really what's most salient to the average person, is that woo itself is a gigantic pitfall. Like, it's not a good thing. It's not healthy. It's actually very unhealthy. And if you know someone who's getting into these practices, like, they're going off the deep end, like, I think that's more of the kind of accepted way of looking at this. And it's it's true. I mean, it's an important thing to acknowledge here. The thing about woo is because it's so open, because again it's so individualistic, and because there's no sort of rules, there's no structure um, to it. Again, there's a lot of room for creeping increasingly towards what feels good, or what feels convenient, or what kind of confirms your biases. So you can't really wander off into a scientific realm and just make it up and have it land. And you can see this in the world of engineering, for instance. It's like, that's like a scientific domain. It's like engineering. You're trying to solve problems and build shit. If you go off and become an engineer, and you just kind of like, I think that, like, this will work, I'm going to build this bridge, and I'm just going to manifest the bridge will hold the amount of weight it needs to hold. If you try that, people will go on the bridge and it will collapse, and it doesn't work. It's been falsified. It's like, that's the scientific realm. But the realm of the spiritual, and the realm of the woo, for instance, it doesn't have that. There's nothing quantifiable, provable, falsifiable. And so it's very easy to just make it up as you go. And that's a slippery slope. And people will tend to gravitate in, like, maybe weirder and weirder and more convenient direction, until they've actually kind of maybe lost sight of what's real in a pretty significant way. So there's that, but there's also, because this is a attempt to recover religion. Religions often form around some sort of figure, right? And so cults are kind of an attempt to rebuild a religion from scratch around like a new Jesus. Here's my new Jesus, right? And that's very human. It's very archetypal to do this, to find a new figure that is very persuasive, maybe very sexy, maybe has like a lot of really interesting, persuasive views, and they get wrapped up in the religious function there of being with others. You're kind of being united. You're all sort of rallying around a common idea, a common God, essentially. And for like the Manson family, for instance, like their Jesus was Charles Manson, and their God was kind of like these strange ideas that started forming about helter skelter, and there's going to be a gigantic race war, and they went around murdering people. It's like, so is that woo? Is Charles Manson woo? There's some overlap for sure. And there's a deep end you could fall off of. It's probably not going to lead to you going around murdering people. That's probably not going to happen. It's not going to get that extreme, so it's probably not that dangerous, but it does happen. And the experiment has been ran uh, in the 60s and 70s, right? There's a lot of examples of alternative, countercultural, religious revival movements that went wrong, basically. I mean, you can see that over and over again in the 60s and 70s, especially.
I think just to quickly add on to that point is that when we're dealing with a realm like the New Age or Woo that's tapping into the religious dynamic and the mythic sort of archetypal space, that the type of powerful dynamics, especially psychologically, spiritually, that opens up within people, leaves them so vulnerable. Sometimes, yes, to like the cult figure who can manipulate you, take all your money, whatever. But on like a lower level, that's still to me quite dangerous, and it's probably more likely to happen is like the wounded individual looking for answers, looking for guidance, looking for insights, who will turn to practices like going to a psychic, going to a card reader, reading something in the stars, and having that dictate their life choices so that they release all sense of autonomy to the higher being, God, whatever it is that they're working with. And I have seen this happen, whether that's pulling tarot cards in a way that says, oh, my boyfriend's cheating on me, I have to break up with them, or I went to a psychic who told me I have some sort of dark entity around me, you have to pay $3,000 for me to clear it. It's those forms of manipulation that aren't safeguarded because the community isn't there to hold individuals accountable for it. And you see that quite a bit with a sort of charlatan archetype uh, that is quite well known in these new age spaces. So another thing definitely to just point out as one of those pitfalls. And maybe we will look at this next question from Chaitanya. Arin, what is your most woo identified practice?
Um, I have been investigating a form of active imagination for a while now that I find quite interesting. And it's kind of like journeying. So
Mm,
I
mhm.
think if I was going to explain this to most of my peers or most of the people I know in real life, they would find this to be quite weird, and I think that they would, you know, be like, okay, Arn is sort of getting into some like weird stuff, and I'm kind of actually worried about him. But essentially, it's spending time conjuring up sub personalities in my mind and going on sort of journeys with them where like we travel and go through portals and end up in different locations and interact with other sub personalities. And there's a similarity. I mean, obviously, I can explain it in a way that makes it sound like it's not very woo, but you could definitely explain it in a much more woo way. Like you could say, like, I am essentially sitting down to talk to spirits, right? It's like that's kind of the equivalent. I think that could be really beneficial and really healthy for someone to do, is to sit down and try and talk to the spirit of uh, bravery, for instance, and be like, what does the spirit of bravery have to tell me? What advice does it have? Or I'm sitting down, I'm going to talk to a demon, and what does this demon have to tell me? What does this demon want from me? Or I'm sitting down, I'm going to talk to my my grandmother who has died, what does she have to tell me? And like that sounds pretty woo. The idea that you're not only talking to people who are dead, but you're talking to like demons and stuff. But you know, I would explain it in a way that wouldn't be very woo, which is that like I'm using my sort of imaginal dream function to conjure up aspects of myself, personify aspects of myself, so I can actually externalize those aspects and engage with them to create some sort of externalized change, in those aspects of me that are in turn re-internalized and create real change. And that's essentially what you're doing when you talk to a therapist, right? But only in this case, it's not a therapist; it's a spirit. So, anyways, that's there's other things too I could talk about. I mean, like, I do tarot also, and I find it quite interesting to mess with tarot. And Alyssa and I teach tarot together, and we're working on a tarot handbook right now. So I mean, like, that's pretty woo. And if some of my other friends see that like Arran's written a book about tarot, they'll probably think that's pretty weird. But I think it's powerful. I think it's important to explore, and I think that just it works in concert with all of my scientific, philosophical, very grounded in reality pursuits. It's just like a different side of the coin that I think is really, really important.
Yeah, it's the method that Aron's talking about, I think at its most woo is drawing upon sort of like a shamanic journeying that he's mentioned, along with active imagination, which really is a form of journeying just through a more like secular psychological lens, through Jung's development of it, and also internal family systems therapy, which is this idea that we are a sort of plurality of intrapsychic figures. Like there's not just a single version of us. There are, there's a young, exiled inner child, and there are these parts that manage us, and et cetera, et cetera. So we can see these practices, and you can look at them from a more grounded view, like internal family systems therapy, or you could look at it through the journeying figures that a shamanic practitioner works with. But the psychological phenomena is all the same. So it's kind of woo and kind of not woo at the same time. And you'll see some of these ideas popping up, in mainstream, even scientific places like modern psychology. So for anyone really interested, I think even just looking into internal family systems therapy starts to introduce certain ideas that tie back to religious New Age woo practices as well.
All right. We're going to wrap it up now. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. We think it's a really interesting topic, and there's plenty more to explore, and I'm sure we will in future episodes. So tune in next week for our next live stream. We're also hoping to have some guests on our live stream coming up in the future, and we're hoping to make that a regular thing. And maybe we can even get some famous people on here like we did before. That's our hope. So thanks again, and we will see you next week. If you find our content useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up with my explorations, musings, and stay updated on the project, subscribe to the Golden Shadow Journal at goldenshadow.substack.com.
Thanks for watching.
See you later.